On the 16th of April 1946, Rudolf Höss, the Commandant of Auschwitz concentration camp, was led through his former camp to a gallows which had been made for him. He was helped to the execution structure by a number of guards, as well as a hooded executioner, who was there to perform the last execution inside of a site where over 1 million people lost their lives because of the cruelty of the man who was being secured to the noose. Rudolf Höss was the man who created Auschwitz, and he then expanded it to become the most ruthless and deadly extermination facility established inside of the Third Reich. He was someone who had little redeeming qualities, and he was someone who also seemingly bragged about the death toll that he was responsible for. Höss believed he could leave his slaughterous job each day and return home to his family as if he had been working a normal job, but he was able to leave his murderous actions at the door. But who was the man who commanded Auschwitz for so long? Why was he forced out of the camp? And why ultimately did he go to the gallows for his crimes? Welcome to The Untold Past. Join us today as we look at the dark evil of the Commandant of Auschwitz, and as always, to support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Rudolf Höss began his career inside of the military when at just the age of 14 he was admitted into his father's old regiment, the German Army's 21st Regiment of Dragoons. He was fighting a year later in Iraq, and he was even present during the Armenian genocide. But he eventually became the youngest non-commissioned officer in the German army, and he did during the war become infected with malaria, and he was also wounded 3 times. But he evaded capture during the conflict, and what is shocking is that when the armistice came, Höss then went back to finish his secondary education, having fought in different continents. He also began to become exposed to right-wing politics, and he joined the Freikorps, a group of German veterans who were armed, and they opposed the signing of the Treaty of Versailles and other Weimar Republic decisions. But in 1922 he heard Adolf Hitler speak for the first time, and Höss then joined the Nazi Party. This was a transformative moment in Höss's life, as he would then later rise throughout the Nazi ranks in the following decades, to the point where he became a commandant inside of the deadliest concentration camp of the Second World War. But before all of this, Höss exhibited violent tendencies, as he was involved in the murder of a schoolteacher with other Freikorps members, and the man who ordered this murder was no other than Martin Bormann, the man who would later become Hitler's private secretary. Höss was later tried as the ringleader of this murder, and he was sentenced to 10 years imprisonment, and Bormann only got 1 year. But Höss was then given different privileges inside of his prison for his behaviour, and he was released from prison 5 years later in 1928. He then joined another group, the Ottoman League, and he seemed to find company and solace within these radical groups, and it was within the Ottoman League that he met his wife Hedwig Hensel, later Hedwig Höss. The couple would go on to have 5 children, with the youngest, a daughter, being actually born inside of Auschwitz. He was a man who was comfortable with murdering, and Höss later joined the SS, and he linked up with a cavalry group, but around 1933 he began to attract the attention of Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS. Himmler had inspected his group at Stettin, and the pair had met before, and they struck up a friendship over the next few years. But Höss was then later moved to the Death's Heads unit, and it was clear that Himmler saw something in Höss that would one day turn him into an even bigger monster. Höss was first sent to Dachau concentration camp, and he served as a block leader in the camp, and he was learning under more senior SS guards, and he was then moved over to Sachsenhausen concentration camp, and he was given command of the execution squads there. He was someone who on the 15th of September 1939 ordered the firing squad to fire into the first conscientious objector to be executed under the Second World War, a man named August Dickmann. Höss, even then when Dickmann had been shot by the firing squad, approached his lifeless body and shot him in the head with a pistol, giving him a coup de grace gunshot to ensure his death. Inside of the site he was also involved in the torture of the prisoners, and he forced prisoners to stand outside all night in freezing cold conditions with little clothing, and some of the prisoners were taken to the hospital and they were denied any treatment. Dozens died in these evenings due to his orders and treatment. But still his relationship with Heinrich Himmler would be what would give him opportunities to delve into his brutal side, and he was then sent to Western Poland to investigate an area to make a new concentration camp. With this, the reports published by Höss led to the building of what became Auschwitz, and he was personally appointed by Himmler to become the commandant of that site. The head of the SS believed Höss had the brutality and qualities needed to ruthlessly instigate a reign of terror over a camp that would be responsible for the deaths of over 1 million people. The site of Auschwitz to begin with was nowhere near the huge killing site it became, and Höss oversaw this huge expansion, using the slave labour of the prisoners to build new areas. When he went to Auschwitz, he was given command, and Höss claimed that he wanted to do things differently, and he later experimented with different ways of killing as many prisoners as he could in the most efficient way. He trialled many different methods, and all whilst this was going on, his wife Hedwig and children were living in a villa next to the camp, where they had a number of slaves or prisoners who tended to their needs in the gardens of the house. They were living in luxury within a stone's throw away of people who were starving and dying. Hedwig Höss claimed she did not know the true nature of the camp to begin with, but she must have known that inside of the camp there was a horrific reputation for bad treatment and slaughter. The earliest prisoners of Auschwitz were sent to brick buildings, but at its height there were 3 different specific areas of Auschwitz, all with different intentions. Auschwitz I was deemed the head site in the administrative complex, and Auschwitz II-Birkenau was the main extermination centre, with Auschwitz III being a slave labour facility for different German industrial companies. Höss also built torture blocks inside of his camp, with Block 11 being known for it, and inside here he used devices such as the standing cells to brutalise the prisoners. Inmates were also shot on the death wall at the back of this block, in a courtyard, with thousands being executed in this site by the SS guards. Höss would order mass executions if a prisoner did manage to escape, but he was then ordered to Berlin to meet with Himmler to repair Auschwitz for what became known as the final solution. He was told to prepare the camp to become a site of mass slaughter on an even bigger scale, on what was regarded as an industrial level of killing. He allegedly told his wife about the purpose of Auschwitz at the end of 1942, when she confronted him about it, as she had overheard another SS man talking about the destructive nature of her husband's work. But Höss was a man who began to test mass murder techniques, and as mentioned, he would settle on the use of gas inside of bunkers or chambers to kill as many people on a huge scale. This was settled on as a guard had fallen asleep in his car after drinking, and he had left his car running, almost killing him in his garage. But the practical operations for the deaths at Auschwitz saw prisoners brought to the camp on trains, and then the inmates would be sorted. Those fit enough to conduct slave labour were admitted into the camp, and those who were not would be sent another way, towards the gas chambers. Those who were older, and mothers with their children, were usually sent straight to their deaths. Prisoners then were stripped naked and shaved of their hair before they were tattooed with a prisoner number. Over Höss's time in command, the gas chambers were expanded and made larger, and crematorias were built to deal with the bodies on a huge scale, with the fires going all day to deal with the thousands of people being killed. At times, Auschwitz could not cope with the amount of slaughter going on inside the camp, and Höss later wrote of his actions that, technically it wasn't so hard, it would not have been hard to exterminate even greater numbers. The killing itself took the least time. You could dispose of 2,000 heads in half an hour, but it was the burning that took all the time. The killing was easy. You didn't even need the guards to drive them into the chambers. They just went in, expecting to take showers, and instead of water, we turned on poison gas. The whole thing went by very quickly. Let's also remember that Rudolf Höss oversaw hangings, the use of lethal injections inside the hospitals, and executions using violent beatings inside of Auschwitz. He also learned of the torture of prisoners and issued it, but he would not be a man who was also faithful to his wife. In 1942 he began an affair with an Austrian political prisoner of war in the camp, and she then became pregnant, and she was imprisoned inside of a standing cell, and she was then forced to have a termination inside of Auschwitz's hospital. She was very close to being selected and sent to the gas chambers, but when the SS command heard of this, Höss was shockingly relieved from his position as the Commandant of Auschwitz, being replaced with a man slightly more lenient, Arthur Lever-Henschel. But Rudolf Höss would not be done with Auschwitz, as he was sent back to the camp on the 8th of May 1944 to oversee one of the most destructive killing operations of the Second World War. Named Operation Höss after him, 430,000 Hungarian Jews were sent to Auschwitz, where they were killed in 56 horrific days. The camp could not cope with the amount of death, and guards and other members of staff were forced to burn the bodies of the victims in huge open pits. 10,000 people were being gassed every single day, and then to go alongside this, as the gas chambers could not handle the huge numbers of people, prisoners were shot in trenches by the SS. Höss finished the Second World War working inside of Ravensbrück concentration camp, where he constructed a gas chamber where over 2,000 women were killed inside of. But Rudolf Höss was advised towards the end of the conflict to go into hiding, and he had on his possession cyanide capsules for he and his wife, as well as their children, should they have needed them. Höss feared being captured by the Soviets, and he later claimed that regarding this decision to not end his own life that, because of the children, we did not do this. For their sake, we wanted to take on our own shoulders all that was coming, but we should have done it. I have always regretted it since. We would have all been spared a great deal, especially my wife and children. How much more suffering will they have to endure? We were bound and fettered to the other world, and we should have disappeared with it. Höss lived under the false name of Franz Lang, and the Commandant of Auschwitz was now working as a gardener in Gottrupel, and he evaded capture for around a year. He was seized by the British forces, who battered him with axe handles after they discovered his true identity, as his wedding ring was engraved with his own name and also his wife's. He could have been killed by the party that arrested him, and there were reports that he even tried to bite down on a cyanide capsule. He was then brought to the Nuremberg trials, and he claimed about his actions inside of Auschwitz that, "I commanded Auschwitz until the 1st of December 1943, and estimate that at least 2.5 million victims were executed and exterminated there by gassing and burning, and at least another 500,000 succumbed to starvation and disease, making a total of around 3 million dead. This figure represents about 70 to 80% of all persons sent to Auschwitz as prisoners, the remainder having been selected and used for slave labour in the concentration camp industries. Including amongst the executed and burned were approximately 20,000 Russian prisoners of war, who were delivered at Auschwitz in Wehrmacht transports operated by regular Wehrmacht officers and men. The remainder of the total number of victims included about 100,000 German Jews and great numbers of citizens from the Netherlands, France, Belgium, Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Greece, or other countries. We executed around 400,000 Hungarian Jews alone at Auschwitz in the summer of 1944. Höss then later revised his death toll, and he seemed rather proud of what he had done, slaughtering many people. He was handed over to the Polish, and he was then tried for his actions, and during this he revised his death toll to around 1.1 million people. Whilst he was inside of prison awaiting his execution, as he had been sentenced to death, Rudolf Höss claimed that he had showed some acknowledgement for his crimes. He stated that, "My conscience compels me to make the following declaration. In the solitude of my prison cell, I have come to the bitter recognition that I have sinned gravely against humanity. As Commandant of Auschwitz, I was responsible for carrying out part of the cruel plans of the Third Reich for human destruction. In so doing, I have inflicted terrible wounds on humanity. I caused unspeakable suffering for the Polish people in particular. I am to pay for this with my life. May the Lord God forgive one day what I have done. I ask the Polish people for forgiveness. In Polish prisons, I experienced for the first time what human kindness is. Despite all that has happened, I have experienced humane treatment which I could never have expected, and which has deeply shamed me. May the facts which are now coming out about the horrible crimes against humanity make the repetition of such cruel acts impossible for all time." It was on the 16th of April 1947 that Rudolf Höss was executed. A number of prisoners of Auschwitz had petitioned the judges to allow the execution to take place inside of his former camp, and this was permitted, and a specially built gallows was made for Rudolf Höss. His execution date was delayed as there was concern that he would be lynched en route to Auschwitz, but when he arrived at the camp, he was given a cup of coffee in his former offices, and he was then held in a lockup and was then fetched for his execution. He was then led towards the gallows on the site of the former camp's Gestapo, and he was led up to the execution structure by a hooded executioner. He was then helped onto a step before the noose was secured around his neck, and the trapdoor was then released, and Rudolf Höss, within minutes, was declared dead. Rudolf Höss was a murderer, an executioner, and a torturer. He was a man who wanted to slaughter as many people as possible inside of his concentration camp, and he was very ruthless in the way he went about his work. He had a long history before he went to Auschwitz of murdering and carrying out death. He is considered one of the world's most horrific war criminals in history, and he was someone who, despite showing a small piece of repentance for his actions years later, was a truly ardent Nazi and follower of Adolf Hitler and also Heinrich Himmler. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.